evening. We want to welcome everyone that is here with us this evening, especially our visitors. And we like to ask you to follow along as we study a portion of the Bible. This morning, Ed presented a good lesson to us and had to do with fear. And this evening, I'm going to present a lesson that might remind us of a song that we grew up with in Bible class a lot, This Little Light of Mine. And, we're going to be talking this evening a little bit about that contrast between light and dark. The best example that, that I can give that I've personally experienced is, if anyone's ever been in a cave somewhere, or if any of you have ever actually worked in a coal mine, and I'd always heard my dad tell me, it's so dark down there that, you could be 1 centimeter away from your nose, waving your hand, and you can't see it. But unless you experience it, you never really understand it because it's true. It's true, complete darkness it's just that. It's dark. There's no light there. Nothing can be seen, and it's almost like a thickness. It's disorienting, and it would even disorient guys that were seasoned coal miners underground. Every year we had to do retrainings, and they would bring a trailer into a parking lot, and they would pump it full of smoke, and we would have to crawl through it and use our safety lifeline and our respirators. And, it's just very disorienting, and it can catch you off guard if you're not ready for it. And like I said, even for some people who were, like I said, seasoned coal miners, they still had a hard time with it. The other, example was, caves. If you've ever been on a cave tour, and, I've been on a couple of them, and, they do the same thing. They say, everyone turn your flashlights off, and, it's pretty dark. Maybe not quite as dark as underground, but it's still dark nonetheless, because in the cave tours, you still get a little bit of residual light coming through the entries on either side, but in the coal mine in certain places, there's no source of light anywhere. And some of the guys that work underground, it's their job to go and walk some of these old areas of the coal mine. They call them fire bosses. They are the guys that go in and make sure that the air is the way that's supposed to be, make sure the gas isn't building up. And so they constantly are having to go into these darkest places of the coal mine, sometimes by themselves. And you would hear horror stories from some of the veteran coal miners that were fire bosses. And a lot of the older guys that I worked with, they all wore cheap light up wristwatches, and they were all digital. And they said, I never use an analog clock down here unless it has some kind of light. And this one guy, he told me, he said that he was fire bossing an entry, and his cap light went dead. And that wristwatch, that little glow of telling the time, was how he actually made it out. So with that being said, and all those stories, darkness itself is very overtaking. Like I said, it's very disorienting, but it only takes a little bit of light to overcome that darkness. And like I said, with the example of that guy telling the story of just his little glow of his wristwatch was enough to overpower the darkness for him to get out. So we have this picture in the Bible of the same thing, light and darkness. God created light, and it's like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. True light, true darkness. There's no in between. And that's because, as the example that we have set before us in the Bible, we have examples that tell us of this difference between light and darkness. And in Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 13 through 16, which is where the majority of my lesson came from, and also that song that I mentioned earlier, it says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." And in verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So here we have from Jesus' own mouth, him telling us that we are to be this light. We are to be that opposition, that stark opposition to darkness. We're supposed to be the light. And he also gives us the example of himself and his time on the earth. And we have, fortunately, today we have the full Bible available to us, and we can see how the prophecies were fulfilled and how Jesus' time on the earth and what he did with that time that he was on the earth. And we can see that in John, the 8th chapter, in verse 12, it's John chapter 8 and verse 12, it says, "And when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, 'I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life.'" So he's there again once saying that he's the light of this world and the ultimate source of light against darkness. And also through Jesus' life, you can also see time and time again that since light is in direct opposition or direct contrast to darkness, that darkness was something that Jesus was in opposition with, and that's something that we as Christians should be in opposition with it also. You know, in the 4th chapter of Matthew, and also in the 4th chapter of Luke, we have the examples given to us of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. We have the examples of how he dealt with that. And to reinforce that thought, in Hebrews, the 4th chapter and verse 15, it tells us that he was tempted in all points that we are tempted in today, and yet he was still without sin. So he's once again giving us that example of how to be that light. And then also in Jesus' life, you can't read through without realizing that Jesus was rejected by a lot of the people that were around him. You read and we find out that the what were known as the religious elite, the Pharisees, the ones that were in the know per se, or thought that they were actually rejecting Jesus. They didn't accept him. And that's a shame, because as well as they claim to know the Bible, they should have known about the prophecies. And we have that illustration given to us. We also see that in Jesus' life that he was rejected by those that were even closer to him yet, some of his own disciples. You know, we can remember that Peter denied him 3 times. Judas actually betrayed him. But none of them were completely without blemish, because after he was taken away in the garden, in Mark the 14th chapter and verse 50, it says all of them departed, because they were scared. But nonetheless, we know that Jesus remained perfect and remained true to being that example of that light, and fulfilled that Old Testament prophecy that I had mentioned earlier by dying on the cross and paving the way for that ultimate uh, defeat over darkness. So that brings us to today. We have our examples set before us in the Bible, and how Jesus conducted himself and what he did while he was on this earth, and how he conducted himself all the way up until his ultimate death and his resurrection, and then him returning to heaven. And that's how today God's light is projected. That's how his work, all of his opportunity that he's given to us, that death, burial, and resurrection on the cross, that avenue of being able to go to heaven one day was given to us. So the gospel still delivers us today from darkness, still delivers, still pertinent, just as it is today as it is then. So we have, like I said, Jesus' example, and then let's also think for a moment about the example of after Jesus returned to heaven, after he returned to his heavenly home he said to prepare a place, that we have the examples of those that continued after he was no longer around. And we can also see that just as those ones that were close, as I mentioned before, as Peter and some of the other ones that scattered whenever they were scared, whenever Jesus was ultimately taken away in the garden, that they ended up coming back, of course, after Jesus' return and his transfiguration. So we have time and time again examples of ways where God showed, or Jesus showed his disciples how to treat people. He himself was the ultimate example. Time and time again, he showed compassion. He showed, how we today as Christians should conduct ourselves. And that brings us to, the part of the song that we used to sing, hide it under a bushel. No, that should be, at least conscious on our minds whenever we're thinking how we're to portray ourselves in the world and how that corresponds with being the light. And, following that example that Jesus gives us in the Bible, in Matthew 5 and that verses 13 through 16 that we read, where it says we are to be the salt and the light. We've heard, sermons where, the purpose of salt is to add flavoring, and, that's telling us that we are to be the flavor, God's flavoring to the world. If it becomes, tarnished, or if we're not doing our part, or just not showing the love that we should, that you're going to lose that saltiness, and you're not going to be an effective light for God. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to apply what we read in the Bible and aspect of, how are we, or myself personally, letting His light shine? How is, this opposition, this war between darkness and light, can we see it going on? And, all of us here, I'm sure, would agree that you don't have to look too far to see how dark, the sin of the world actually is. However, just as bad as it is now, doesn't take away from the fact that it was bad for the disciples too. As we know, pretty much all the disciples ended up becoming martyrs. Many of them died, or pretty much all of them died pretty gruesome deaths. If that influence of Jesus and the influence of following something that is false, if that was the case, then, as many have said before, these men wouldn't have died for a lie. So we have examples, like I said, in the Bible of men and disciples who went through tough times, but a lot of people today go through tough times too, and we can always look for that ultimate source of the light, or be the source of light for somebody else. And that's ultimately what Jesus wants us to do. In Matthew, the 6th chapter, in verses 1 through 8, in Matthew, the 6th chapter, in verses 1 through 8, it gives us some more insight. It says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you'll have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." And then it continues on in verse 5 on how to pray. It says, "Do not pray, do not be like the hypocrites, standing in the street corners to be seen by others." And then in 9, it gives us an example of, how we should pray. And then it changes gears and tells us how we should act instead of acting like the hypocrites. It says in 16, it says, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces. Truly I tell you, they have their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and your face, so that you will not be obvious to others you're fasting." And in verse 19, it says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up yourselves treasure in heaven." And continuing on down, it talks about, in verse 22, how the eye is the lamp of the body. And then in 24, it talks about how no one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one or you'll love the other. And so we have our purpose. I'm sorry, I lost my praise. We have our purpose as to, once again, is to glorify God and not ourselves. And in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 20, and 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 20, it says, "You were bought at a price, therefore honor God with your bodies." So it's telling us that that price that we were bought with, Jesus' blood, is so that we can honor him and do his will and be that light to save those that are lost around us. You know, we have examples of, like I keep saying, of the way Jesus conducted himself and how he went out to the people and talked to them, and that's what we should also try to strive to today, is try to find ways that we can show God's light. You know, it kind of reminds me of first of all, the story of the parable. You know, you have, each person had his own talent, and, each one of them did what they thought was right. But the one that didn't do anything and buried it in the ground, he was happy because he still had what he gave him. But he didn't do anything with it. He buried it in the ground. And that kind of reminded me of a story of this guy that loved cars. He loved talking about them, loved buying them, owned a lot of them. And he had some really nice cars. They were some one-of-a-kind cars, at least for the Ohio Valley. And some of them were show quality. This one car in particular, he bought it from a guy that never drove it on the road once, and it just sat in his garage. And he never did anything with it. Every once in a while, he'd get it out and polish it up, look at it, shove it back in the garage. And after a while, people started asking him, "What are you going to do with that car? You going to, do anything with it?" "Well, I don't really plan on doing anything with it right now." And he said, "Well, he was a really close friend." And he said, "Well, why don't you let me clean it up and I'll take it to the car show?" Nope. That story being said, is that if you have a shiny car and it's meant to be seen and it can be enjoyed and it's meant to be, like I said, seen by others, don't leave it parked in the garage. Even if you do keep it nice and shiny, it's not doing any good. And that's the same with us. If we're constantly shielding ourselves, if we're constantly, as it said in Matthew, where it says, we're not to hide the light. We're supposed to be a city on a hill. As the little song, or as the song says, not to hide it under a bushel. So we're to keep that in mind as Christians, as we're going through our Christian growth and studying with people and thinking about how we are to evangelize. It's by looking for ways to be that light. And like I said in the beginning, light is the direct opposite of darkness. So it doesn't take a whole lot of light to, cause a big impact on darkness, no matter how dark it is. So we are to shine before men. As I said, we're to be conscious of how we are in the community, how we are in our homes, how we are at our jobs, how we are in every aspect of our life, because we're supposed to be shedding God's light. And just as Jesus was rejected by some of his close family members, friends, those around him, some of us, unfortunately, are probably going to be rejected by people. That shouldn't be a badge that we wear on our shoulder, like, I'm being rejected by everybody, so I must be doing everything right. It's not to say that's 100% wrong, but that's to say that, we should be trying to look for ways to get people to look towards God and not look towards, you know, unfortunately, some people think that it needs to be, as the Pharisees did, a prestigious kind of situation where really we're just all striving to get to heaven together. You know, so as I mentioned, where light can't have fellowship with darkness, and how unfortunately sometimes we're going to be rejected just like Jesus did by those around him, that doesn't mean that we should back away or try to, as the song says, hide it under a bushel. You know, sometimes, especially now, people in the world that is a lot of opinions, and whenever anyone may disagree with that opinion that they may hold, most of them, unfortunately, don't accept it well. But that's still not our problem. That's still our job to be that light, regardless. So, and that brings us to what the Bible tells us in 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, and verses 1 through 5. In 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, and 1 through 5, it says, "In the presence of God and Jesus, who will judge the living and the dead, and in view his appearing in kingdom, I give you this charge. Preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. They will turn their ears away from the truth and turn aside to myths. But you will keep your head in all situations, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry." So there he tells us just that. We are to keep our head in all situations and be ready for in season and out of season. We have to be ready to give an answer, to shed that light on the darkness whenever that time may come. And ultimately, as we have said before, you know, the ultimate reason is shedding our light to the world and making sure that we're doing our part to those around us is so that they can enjoy that light themselves, to be saved and come into that light. You know, we can all picture a lighthouse, and we know that a lighthouse is there to provide light to those that are sailing and those that are out at sea, whether it's to keep them away from the dangers of the shore or just to give them a general direction in the first place. You know, they position them in areas where they can be seen for as far as possible. Are we positioning ourselves or putting ourselves in position so that our light can be seen as much or maybe as far as possible? Are we doing our part to educate, you know, those that are lost around us on what's missing in their life, that light that is in direct contrast to the darkness in the world? You know, we saw in the beginning of this lesson, you know, we have the example of Jesus being that ultimate example of light. We know that in the Bible it portrays the light as good and the darkness as evil, and Jesus and God have no fellowship with evil. And we also know that Jesus prepared and provided that way so that we can have that actual escape from darkness of this world. That his death on that cross, that his resurrection, and everything that he sacrificed for us is so that everyone can enjoy and be in that light. And then applying it to our personal lives, making sure that whenever we leave here that we remember the examples, and are we going back and possibly, taking or wiping the dust per se off of some of our areas in our life where we know that maybe we could be talking, or like I said, shedding God's light on someone or trying to reach out to someone. So we have to try to, like I said, apply it to our lives. And the first step in doing that tonight, before we sing our song of invitation, is that you have to be baptized. You have to take advantage of that cleansing water of baptism that's only there because of Jesus' death on the cross. And through that burial of baptism and the rising of through the waters, that there's the new light and the save that is offered through Jesus' death. So if you need to be baptized, or if you've fallen away, or if you just need prayers of congregation, please do so now as we stand and